The first conversations are not really about you, not in the way they will be later. In the beginning, when the distance is fresh and the management strategies are running at full strength, the avoidant talks about you to their friends the way someone describes a closed chapter. Brief, summarized, stripped of the texture that would make the conversation actually about the relationship rather than about the fact that a relationship existed and has now, by their account, concluded. They will mention you if asked. They will not bring you up unprompted. And when the topic does arrive, the language they use is doing specific work that has nothing to do with informing their friends, and everything to do with managing their own interior. The relationship gets filed under complicated, under wasn't really working, under the kind of vague, deflecting characterization that closes a subject rather than opening it. Their friends, who know them well enough to recognize the pattern, generally let it close. This is not new behavior. The avoidant has been doing some version of this, summarizing rather than processing, concluding rather than examining, for as long as the friendship has existed. Nobody pushes. Pushing has never produced anything except more distance, and friends who have stayed close to an avoidant for any length of time have learned this the hard way, usually more than once. What this means is that the avoidant's first line of coping happens almost entirely without witnesses. The friends are present, technically, the conversations occur, but the actual content, the feeling underneath the summary, stays exactly where it has always stayed, contained, private, inaccessible even to the people who have earned, through years of loyalty, more access than this. Understand what the avoidant is actually managing in these early exchanges, because it is not simply the loss of the relationship. It is the loss plus the threat of being perceived while losing it. For someone whose entire relational architecture is built around controlling what is visible, grief is uniquely dangerous. Grief does not ask permission to surface. It does not wait for a convenient moment or check whether the management system has cleared it for public display. It arrives according to its own logic, and the avoidant's first and most urgent task, upon feeling its early movements, is not processing it. It is containing it before anyone notices it is there. This containment takes a specific form in conversations with friends. The avoidant becomes, paradoxically, more socially fluent than usual, more willing to engage, more present in conversation, more available for plans and activities and the ordinary texture of friendship. Not because they are doing well, but because staying busy and staying visible in low-stakes contexts is one of the most effective tools available for keeping the real material below the surface. Motion is easier to sustain than stillness. Stillness is where the feeling finds room to move. Friends frequently misread this. They see someone who seems, if anything, slightly more present than before, showing up to things, making jokes, engaging with an energy that looks like resilience, or even relief. What they are actually watching is a highly competent containment operation. The avoidant is not avoiding grief by ignoring it. They are avoiding it by outrunning it, filling the spaces where it would otherwise surface with enough alternative content that there is no room left for the material trying to emerge. This works for a while. It always does. The avoidant has been running some version of this operation their entire adult life, and the early version of it, post-loss, is simply the most recent application of a very well-practiced skill. The first crack tends to appear in an unguarded moment. Not in a deliberate conversation about the relationship. The avoidant is too skilled at managing those, but somewhere unplanned. A joke that lands wrong, a reference made by someone else that catches them slightly off guard. A song, a place, a particular kind of evening that happens to resemble, in some detail too specific to be coincidental, something from the relationship. In that moment, something shows, briefly. A pause that is a beat too long, a flatness in the response that does not match the casual tone of the conversation around it. A quality of having been, for half a second, somewhere else entirely. Most friends, even close ones, miss this. It is small. It resolves quickly. The avoidant recovers, redirects, returns to the conversation with enough fluency that the moment passes without comment. But the friends who know the avoidant well, who have spent enough years learning to read the specific grammar of someone who communicates more through absence than presence, these friends notice. Not loudly, not with concern voiced in the moment, because voicing it would only accelerate the avoidant's retreat back into management. But they file it. They begin to understand, often before the avoidant does, that what is being presented as resolved is not resolved. That the summary, complicated, wasn't working, moved on, is doing more work than the situation actually supports. This is usually the first external evidence, however subtle, that something more is happening beneath the managed surface. The avoidant does not know this is being noticed. They believe, at this stage, that the containment is fully successful. It is one of the specific ironies of this process that the people around the avoidant often perceive the depth of the loss before the avoidant consciously does. As the weeks continue, something begins to shift in how the avoidant relates to ordinary social contact. The early period of overcompensating busyness starts to develop fatigue. Not visible fatigue. The avoidant does not announce that the performance is becoming difficult to sustain, but a kind of quiet attrition in the energy behind it. The jokes become slightly more effortful. The willingness to engage starts to require more deliberate generation than it did initially, when the outrunning strategy still had momentum. This is the period in which friends often notice the avoidant pulling back from them specifically, which is a confusing development if you do not understand the mechanism behind it. It would seem, intuitively, that someone struggling with a loss would lean more heavily on friendship rather than less. But the avoidant's retreat from friends in this period is not a retreat from support. It is a retreat from the specific exhaustion of performing wellness in front of an audience. Containment requires energy, maintaining the summary, the deflection, the casual tone that keeps the conversation from drifting toward the actual material. This is active work, and active work depletes. As the depletion accumulates, the avoidant begins to find it easier to simply have less contact, fewer plans, shorter conversations, a general thinning of the social engagement that, weeks earlier, had been almost manic in its determination to stay full. Friends interpret this in different ways, depending on how well they know the pattern. Some worry it signals something is wrong, without quite being able to name what. Some interpret it as the avoidant needing space, and respect that interpretation by giving it, which inadvertently provides exactly the kind of solitude that the next phase of this process requires. Either way, the avoidant is moving, almost without choosing to, away from the people who could distract them, and toward the quiet that eventually makes distraction impossible to sustain. In the quiet, the first real engagement with the loss begins. Not because the avoidant decided to engage with it, because the strategies that were preventing engagement have run out of fuel. This is the period that almost never gets witnessed by friends directly, because it does not happen in conversation. It happens in the ordinary, unstructured hours of daily life, driving somewhere, doing something repetitive and undemanding, lying awake in the specific stretch of night when the mind is least manageable. It happens in the gaps between the performance, where the performance is no longer being actively maintained because no one is currently watching. What surfaces in these gaps is not a single realization. It is a slow accumulation of specific, unbidden memory. Not the relationship in general. The avoidant has been successfully managing the general category for weeks, but particular fragments that arrive with a vividness the general summary cannot account for. A specific exchange, a specific quality of someone's attention, a specific moment of having been understood in a way that, examined honestly, the avoidant has not experienced before or since. These fragments are uncomfortable, specifically because they resist the narrative. The story that has been maintained, it wasn't working, it was complicated, the distance was reasonable, requires the relationship to have been, on some fundamental level, insufficient. The fragments do not cooperate with this requirement. They keep surfacing as evidence of something that was, in fact, sufficient. Often more than sufficient. Often the most genuine experience of being known that the avoidant can locate in their relational history. This is where the slow realization begins. Not as a single dramatic moment, but as a quiet, repeated collision between the story being maintained and the evidence that keeps refusing to support it. The next time the avoidant talks to friends about the relationship, something has changed, even if the avoidant has not yet noticed the change themselves. The summary starts to develop inconsistencies. Where previously the language was uniformly dismissive, complicated, wasn't right, moved on, now there are moments where something more specific slips through. A detail mentioned that does not fit the dismissive frame. A quality of hesitation before the usual deflecting phrase. As though the phrase no longer arrives as automatically as it once did. An admission, small and quickly walked back, that something about the relationship was genuinely good. Friends who are paying attention notice this shift before they fully understand what it signals. The avoidant who once shut the subject down quickly now lingers slightly longer before doing so. The flatness in the early descriptions starts to develop texture. Not yet emotional openness, but the first sign that the subject has stopped being fully resolved in the avoidant's own mind. This is often the point at which a friend, if they are perceptive and patient and have earned enough trust to risk it, asks a slightly more direct question than has been asked before. Not confrontational, not "do you miss them?" which would likely trigger immediate retreat. Something gentler, something that creates space without demanding entry. The avoidant's response to this kind of question, at this stage in the process, tends to be more honest than anything offered earlier. Not because they have decided to be honest, but because the management system has been worn down enough by the accumulated weight of the surfacing memories that maintaining the previous level of containment has become genuinely difficult. What comes out is often shorter than a full admission and longer than the previous dismissals. A pause, an acknowledgement, however minimal, that the situation was more significant than previously stated. This is usually the first crack visible to someone other than the avoidant. What follows this first crack is not a flood. It would be convenient, narratively, if the dam simply broke and the full feeling arrived all at once, witnessed and processed and resolved in a single cathartic conversation. This is not how it happens for someone with this architecture. What follows instead is a slow, uneven, frequently interrupted process of increasing honesty. 2 steps of genuine disclosure, followed by 1 step of retreat back into the old, deflecting language. A moment of real vulnerability with one friend, followed by weeks of returning to the summarized version with everyone else. The avoidant does not move through this in a straight line. They move through it the way water moves through uneven ground, finding the path of least resistance, doubling back, occasionally pooling in places before finding a way to continue. Friends who stay present through this uneven process, without pushing, without demanding consistency, without treating the retreats as failures or the disclosures as breakthroughs that obligate continued openness, provide something the avoidant has rarely had access to. A relational context where the inconsistency itself is tolerated, where the avoidant does not have to choose between full containment and full disclosure, because the friendship does not require either extreme in order to remain stable. This tolerance is itself a significant factor in what allows the realization to continue developing. Because one of the specific things the avoidance system is testing, often without conscious awareness of the testing, is whether showing the real material produces consequence. Whether friends who glimpse the actual grief will weaponize it, minimize it, demand more of it than is currently available, or otherwise produce the kind of response that confirms the original architecture's belief that vulnerability is costly. When the friends simply continue being friends, present, unhurried, neither alarmed nor demanding, something in the avoidance system receives information it did not expect to receive. The exposure did not produce the anticipated harm, and that information, accumulated across multiple small instances, becomes part of what eventually makes fuller honesty possible. Somewhere in this period, a specific kind of conversation tends to occur. not orchestrated, not planned by either party, usually arriving during an ordinary evening in the middle of something else, when the avoidance guard happens to be lower than usual for reasons that may have nothing to do with the relationship at all. Tiredness, a few drinks, the specific ease that sometimes arrives unbidden in long-standing friendships. In this conversation, more comes out than has come out before. Not the full picture. The avoidant rarely produces the full picture in a single sitting, even at this stage, but something that moves meaningfully past the previous summaries. A specific memory shared with detail rather than abbreviation. An admission of something they did in the relationship that they now recognise with discomfort as having been unfair. A description of a quality the person had, your specific quality, the way you saw them, the way you made the world feel different, that carries genuine warmth rather than the flat, managed tone of earlier accounts. Friends who witness this conversation often describe a feeling of finally seeing the avoidant they had always sensed was there beneath the practiced composure. Not because the avoidant has become a different person, because the conversation has, for a window of time, allowed access to material that is usually kept fully contained. The avoidant, in the aftermath of this kind of conversation, often experiences something close to vulnerability hangover, a specific discomfort arriving the next day or in the days following about having said more than intended, a pulling back, sometimes, from the friend who witnessed the disclosure, not out of anger, but out of the system's habitual response to having been exposed. This pulling back is not a reversal of the realization. It is the predictable cost of having allowed it to surface, and it usually resolves on its own once the avoidant confirms, through continued ordinary contact with the friend, that the disclosure did not produce lasting consequence. What is actually happening underneath these conversations deserves specific attention, because the realization is not simply, I miss them. It is considerably more layered than that, and the layering matters for understanding why this process takes the time it takes. The first layer is the recognition of specific absence. The particular, concrete missing of someone's actual presence, rather than the general missing of companionship. This layer surfaces relatively early, in the unguarded fragments described earlier, and is the easiest layer to acknowledge, because it does not yet require examining the avoidant's own behaviour. The second layer is harder. It is the recognition that the absence is connected to choices the avoidant made, not circumstances, not incompatibility, choices. The specific instances of withdrawal, the specific moments where warmth was met with distance, the specific pattern that, examined honestly, produced the conditions under which the relationship became unsustainable for the other person. This layer requires the avoidant to hold themselves accountable in a way the earlier summaries were specifically designed to avoid. The third layer, which tends to arrive last and is the most difficult, is the recognition of the relationship's actual value relative to the avoidant's broader relational history. This is where the realization stops being about this specific loss and starts being about pattern, about what this person provided that the avoidant has rarely, if ever, received elsewhere, about the specific quality of being seen, of being loved without the love being weaponized, of having been offered something genuine and consistently meeting it with management rather than reception. It is this third layer, when it arrives, that produces the deepest shift in how the avoidant talks about the relationship going forward. Not just sadness about losing someone, recognition of having lost someone specific, someone who, examined honestly against the full landscape of who has been in the avoidant's life, does not have an obvious replacement. Friends notice this shift in language most clearly. The vocabulary changes. Where the relationship was once complicated or didn't work, it becomes, in later conversations, something closer to, I really loved her, or I really loved him, phrased plainly, without the qualifying language that earlier accounts required. Where the avoidant once deflected questions about whether they miss the person, they now sometimes volunteer the missing without being asked. This is not a single conversation in which everything changes. It is a gradual erosion of the deflecting vocabulary, replaced increasingly by language that is more accurate to what is actually being felt. Friends who have known the avoidant a long time often remark, privately, to each other, sometimes to the avoidant directly, that they have never heard them talk about anyone this way before. Not with this much specificity, not with this little defended distance. This observation, when it reaches the avoidant, often produces a complicated response. Part of them receives it as confirmation of something they have been independently arriving at. Part of them experiences it as exposure, evidence that the containment, which they believed was largely successful, has actually been visibly imperfect for some time. The combination of confirmation and exposure is uncomfortable, but it is also, in its way, clarifying. If people who know them well can see how significant this was, the significance is harder to continue minimizing internally. There is a particular kind of conversation that tends to occur once the realization has moved through its earlier layers. A conversation in which the avoidant, often for the first time, articulates not just that they miss the person, but that they understand, with some precision, what they actually lost. This articulation usually does not focus on circumstances or compatibility, the categories the early summaries relied on. It focuses on quality of experience, the way the person made them feel safe in a way that nothing else in their life replicates. The specific texture of being known by someone who saw past the managed surface and continued choosing to stay anyway, for as long as they were able to. The recognition that whatever was difficult about the relationship, and there were genuine difficulties, the avoidant is now honest enough to acknowledge. None of it changes the fact that what was offered to them was rare. Friends who hear this version of the account are often hearing, for the first time, something close to the avoidant's actual interior experience of the relationship, rather than the managed exterior account. This is significant not because it changes what happened. The relationship still ended, the loss is still real. The pattern that produced the ending is still something the avoidant has to reckon with going forward. But because it represents a genuine shift in the avoidant's relationship to their own honesty. They are no longer performing resolution. They are sitting with the actual weight of what occurred. It is worth addressing directly what this process does and does not mean for you, because the temptation to read this realization as an invitation back into the relationship is strong, and the temptation deserves a clear-eyed response. The avoidant arriving at genuine recognition of what they lost is significant. It is evidence that the connection was real, that your value was perceived even when it was not adequately reflected back to you, and that the loss registered at the depth it deserved to register at, rather than being successfully minimized into nothing. It is not by itself evidence that the underlying pattern has changed. The recognition is necessary for change. Nothing changes that has not first been honestly seen. But recognition and change are not the same event. The avoidant who has reached the point of telling friends, plainly and without deflection, that they loved you and lost something significant, has done real psychological work. Whether that work translates into different behavior in a future relationship, whether with you or with someone else, depends on what happens next. Whether the recognition becomes the beginning of sustained examination, or whether it settles into a kind of permanent, somewhat comfortable grief that does not require the harder work of actually revising the architecture that produced the loss. You are not in a position to know which of these paths the avoidant is on, unless you have direct, current access to their process, which, by the nature of this kind of separation, you likely do not. What you can know is that the version of events you may have feared, that what existed between you registered as nothing, that your love was unseen or unworthy of grief, was not accurate. It registered. It is still registering, in conversations you are not present for, in language that has become more honest than it once was. What you do with that knowledge is the part that belongs to you. It is not a summons. It is not evidence that waiting is warranted. It is simply the truth of what is happening on their side of a distance that, for very good reasons, you may have needed to create. For the avoidant, the slow arrival at this recognition, moving from contained dismissal through accumulating fragments, through the uneven 2 steps forward process of disclosure to friends, through the layered realization of specific loss, behavioral accountability, and comparative significance, represents one of the more genuine psychological developments available to someone with this architecture. It does not happen because they decided it should. It happens because the strategies that were preventing it eventually ran out of capacity to keep preventing it. Because friends provided enough patient, undemanding presence that honesty became survivable in increments. Because the specific person who was lost was significant enough that the management system, built to handle ordinary relational disappointment, was not adequate to fully contain what this particular loss actually was. The friends who witness this process rarely think of themselves as doing anything remarkable. They are simply staying present, asking occasional gentle questions, not pushing when the avoidant retreats, and continuing to show up in the ordinary, unhurried way that good friendship requires. But what they are actually providing, without necessarily naming it this way, is the first relational context in which the avoidant's gradual honesty about loss was met with patience rather than alarm. And that patience is, in its own quiet way, part of what makes the realization possible at all. The avoidant ends up, often months after the relationship's end, in a different relationship with what happened than the one they started with. Not resolved, not healed in any complete sense, but honest, specific, no longer performing a summary that the evidence never actually supported. They loved you. They are, by the time this process has run its course, capable of saying so plainly to the people who know them best, without the deflection that once made saying so impossible. It came late, it came slowly, it came through a process that you were not present to witness and could not have accelerated by staying, but it came. And what it confirms, for whatever that confirmation is worth to you now, from wherever you currently stand in your own life, is that what you offered was real, was received, and was, eventually, in the quiet honesty of conversations you will never hear, finally called by its true name.